Well, good morning. My name is Alan Phillips. I'm an attorney whose practice is focused almost exclusively on vaccine exemptions and waivers. I was, probably like many people listening to this, a concerned parent. I discovered the vaccine controversy when my now 20-year-old son was born, and a friend told me that she had another friend with a child who had become permanently disabled by vaccines, and I had never heard of that. So I did some research. I dug into it and found a wonderful book at my local library by Neil Miller, Vaccines, Are They Really Safe and Effective? And still believe that that's an excellent book to introduce people to the vaccine controversy. But at one point I was so moved by what I was finding when I was researching the vaccine issue that I decided to go back to school, and I picked law school because I wanted to enable myself to do something about the issue and be more effective. And so I actually went back to school after 17 years and picked law school primarily because of the vaccine issue. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only attorney in the country whose practice is focused on exemptions and waivers. So I've been working in this area now as an attorney for the last 10, 11 years, something like that, and have seen more and more of this kind of work in my practice to the point where the last few years, it's really all that I do now in my practice. And there's many, many different aspects to the vaccine controversy, medical, legal, and political, and many facets or aspects to the legal side of it in particular, which has become my focus over the last several years more and more. I mean, you can't separate out medical, legal, political issues in the vaccine controversy, but there's inherent overlap in all of these different parts. But I have increasingly focused on the legal aspects and the underlying politics that has led to the policy and law that we have in place today, and feeds a very aggressive vaccine agenda that is now playing out in America and around the world on multiple levels that we should all be very concerned about, because this is an agenda that is directly contrary to our health and well-being, even though it is presented with a mask or veneer to that effect. But if you look beneath the surface, you don't have to do a lot of digging to find out that most, if not all, of the commonly held beliefs about vaccines in the mainstream world, in the mainstream media, are directly contradicted by the science and increasingly by what's going on in the legal world as well. Politics, laws that are being passed, and so forth. So I wanted to say a few words about school exemptions as a starting point, because that's the area that most people are most aware of and most familiar with in terms of where vaccine issues come up in terms of when people are looking for a way to legally avoid vaccines. But I want to preface that with some information briefly about the scope of the subject of vaccine exemptions and waivers, because it turns out there are over a dozen different contexts and subcontexts in which vaccines are required here in the U.S. and new categories of people being required to get vaccines. And there are one or more exemptions available in each one of these different arenas. But there's a common mistake in terms of the way people in the alternative vaccine community will often frame or phrase this. They'll say, well, vaccines aren't really required because there are exemptions and you can avoid them. And that is not only incorrect as a technical matter, but it's incorrect as a practical matter. Technically, vaccines are legally required in all 50 states and U.S. territories for school enrollment. They are required for immigrants. They're required for military members and families and military contractors. They're required, and in the arena of immigration, that includes foreign adoption. If you're adopting a child or baby from overseas, that child has to be vaccinated. Vaccines are increasingly required in the workplace. Now, this has shown up mostly in the healthcare arena and in hospitals around the country, increasingly mandating flu shots on penalty of losing your job if you don't get a flu shot. This is a trend that is still in progress. There's something on the order of maybe 5,800 or so registered hospitals in the U.S. And the last figure I saw was something, if I remember correctly, 20–30% of the hospitals are already mandating a flu shot. But this is a rapid change over the last couple of years, and we'll see more of this in coming near future years around the country. There are, I think, 3 states that have laws mandating flu shots for healthcare workers, but the individual hospitals or hospital systems, as a matter of company policy, are implementing their own mandates. And that's a whole nother discussion all into itself, how that arena works. But I wanted to point out that vaccines are required in many, many different areas. There are new categories of adults that are being required to get vaccines, not just the healthcare workers, but childcare workers, teachers. The last time I looked, a few weeks ago, there were over 100 vaccine bills pending in over 30 states. And if these bills get passed into law, there will be new laws allowing children to consent to vaccines. They can already do that in 2 states. It's blatantly unconstitutional, but these laws are being passed anyway. Laws in Washington State, Oregon, and California passed in the last 3 years that restrict or make it harder for parents to get exemptions for their kids in school, stepping over, violating constitutional boundaries, in my opinion. But the legislatures are passing these laws anyway. There are bills that, if passed, will allow pharmacists to administer vaccines. They already can in some states. Add more vaccines to the already incredibly overloaded vaccine list that children are already required to get. So just, again, very aggressive agenda playing out, and it really is up to us to organize legislatively and otherwise to fight these new laws, or they'll just keep on coming, and there'll be more and more vaccines required for more and more people. Last figure I saw several weeks ago, there are over 270 new vaccines that are already waiting for approval from the FDA and or in clinical trials, the last stages before going to the FDA. There's no light at the end of this tunnel. There will always be more vaccines, and the reason is kind of simple in one sense. The federal government subsidizes vaccine research and development to the tune of billions of dollars each year. The state and federal governments mandate vaccines. The state and federal governments purchase vaccines, and state and primarily federal government compensate the injuries and death caused by vaccines. And by the way, that happens to the tune of $100 million a year on average, about. And that's despite the fact that we know from the FDA and CDC that 90 to 99% of the serious vaccine adverse events never even get reported. So who knows what the real scope is, but nobody does. The data is not available. So it's a very compelling issue, one of the more compelling issues of our time, and one that we need to inform ourselves about and become aware of. So you get a hold of some of this information and you say, well, I'm not sure I want to do vaccines. And besides, there's other things you can do to address the infectious disease concerns that are more effective in vaccines, a lot less expensive, and a lot more effective. Again, not to digress too long here, but quick example. In 2008, Cuba used what's called homeoprophylaxis. It's the use of homeopathic remedies in the same function as immunizations. And they did this to treat an outbreak of leptospirosis. It's a fever disease that's associated with the flooding they experienced down there in connection with hurricanes and tropical storms. And they used homeoprophylaxis in the fall of 2008 instead of conventional vaccines like they had always done before. They had substantially better results. It was about 1/15 the cost, and nobody is injured or killed when you use homeopathic remedies, as always happens when you have widespread use of immunizations. Now, they did this with 2.5 million people. It wasn't a little study of 20 or 30 people, and you wonder what happens in the real world. This was a real-world example. It was scientifically documented, and I've got a link to an article about that, but people can contact me if they'd like me to send them the link. You can reach me at attorney@vaccinerights.com, and I'd be glad to give people that link or more information about that. In fact, folks are welcome to email me with any questions about exemptions and waivers, and I'm happy to do my best to help them understand that. So what about school exemptions? Well, everywhere that vaccines are mandated for daycare or school, and in the U.S., that's all 50 states and all U.S. territories, there are one or more exemptions of the 3 different kinds of exemptions. There's a medical exemption everywhere, and the laws vary from state to state. And the reason that's the case has to do with the structure of our federal Constitution. And the short story here is that the federal government does not have authority to mandate vaccines for state residents directly. And so the CDC recommends vaccines, the ACIP, they recommend vaccines, but they can't go so far as to mandate that for state residents. Now, the federal government mandates vaccines in federal jurisdictions, the military, immigration, U.S. territories, so forth, any federal jurisdiction. U.S. airspace is a federal jurisdiction. Theoretically, the federal government could I guess, hypothetically, could mandate vaccines for people flying by air. But interstate travel is a federal jurisdiction. If there's an outbreak, the federal government could control interstate travel or require vaccines for interstate travel, if hypothetically, if they wanted to. But for state residents during routine times, that's up to individual states. So every state has its own individual vaccine requirement laws and its own exemption laws. And so there are 3 different kinds. Every state has a medical exemption. Everywhere vaccines are mandated in the U.S., there is a medical exemption. Now, medical exemptions, the specifics are going to vary from state to state or situation to situation. They're pretty difficult to get. Usually you have to have some history of having had some kind of prior vaccine reaction or some medical condition that meets a predefined list of conditions that qualify. If you are successful in qualifying for medical exemption, and if you can get a medical doctor to back you up on that, you probably really have a serious condition and probably should not get a vaccine. But sometimes medical exemptions are for only some vaccines, or they're only temporary. If you want to avoid all vaccines indefinitely, a medical exemption is rarely going to be the way to go. Very few people are going to qualify for that, although if you do, you should definitely go that route. But and in some states, the way the laws are written, and it's just a function of the wording of the laws. In some states, if a doctor makes the recommendation, you have the exemption and that's the end of the story. But in other states, your doctor can recommend a medical exemption, or your child's pediatrician can recommend a medical exemption, and the state can overturn that. And I find myself saying rather cynically, if not right out sarcastically, that, well, of course, a bureaucrat sitting in the state capitol knows more about your child's health condition than your child's own pediatrician, so of course they should have the right to override that. Now, I'm being facetious there, but this is just one of many indications of a dysfunctional society. When the doctor who is treating you or your child does not have the final word in terms of being able to authorize or recommend a medical exemption, that's a pretty sad situation. It can often, though, you might qualify for a medical exemption, but you may still have difficulty finding a doctor who will back you up. And this has to do with the politics in the medical field. Doctors who are in any way outspoken about an alternative view on vaccines, anything that's questioning, challenging, or, God forbid, outright anti-vaccine, is subject to informal, if not even outright formal, disciplinary action from peers in the medical community. In other words, the medical community is a club, and if you don't play by the club rules, you're going to get kicked out of the club. That's the risk. So doctors who choose to think for themselves and follow where their own objective, open-minded thinking takes them, and if in any given instance that takes them to a place where they are outside of the mainstream in any way questioning or challenging vaccines, may bring upon themselves harsh criticism from their peers, from their profession. There's tremendous pressure on doctors to adhere to the status quo. So it can be even hard to find a doctor to back you up, and you almost always have to have a medical doctor making the recommendation if you're going to get a medical exemption. So again, bottom line, if you qualify, you should definitely not get vaccines and pursue that route. But it can be hard to qualify, it can be hard to find a medical doctor. Many states, with respect to school exemptions, may be something on the order of 20, and I see different figures in different places, but roughly 20 states offer a philosophical exemption, and what that means is you don't have to justify it because of your religious beliefs or medical condition. You just choose of your own accord to say, I don't want the vaccines, or I don't want my child to get any vaccines. And considering the enormous pressure to vaccinate and the mandates that are in state law everywhere, it's rather interesting that many states do offer a philosophical exemption. Philosophical exemptions are fine, but they come with only state law rights. And by far the most widely available and the most widely utilized exemption will be one version or another of a religious exemption. And I want to focus on that for a couple of reasons. One, because it's the most widely available and therefore the most widely used. And two, because religious exemptions come with federal First Amendment rights. Our First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution has, among other things, what's called the Free Exercise Clause that refers to the free exercise of religion. And it's not an absolute right, but it's a very powerful right. And federal law is a higher legal authority than state law. So if you have a religious exemption, you have not only those state law rights if the exemption is a state religious exemption law, but you have federal First Amendment rights. And that's a higher legal authority than state law. And there are situations where having a religious exemption and having that additional federal constitutional protection can be very important or even make the difference in whether you're able to keep and exercise the exemption. Philosophical exemptions are much more vulnerable to being withdrawn by state legislators, in my opinion, because if they wanted to withdraw the religious exemptions, they run afoul of not just the people who want to have that right specifically, but people who are concerned about religious freedom generally. That risks or would risk being seen as an erosion of the freedom of religion generally. And I think a lot of people who don't care about the vaccine religious exemption specifically would still be concerned if states were trying to pull those repeal religious exemptions. So with a religious exemption, you can go just about anywhere in the U.S. and still exercise a religious exemption. The two states that don't have a religious exemption, and that's West Virginia and Mississippi, but 48 states and all U.S. territories do offer religious exemptions, so it's more portable. You could have a philosophical exemption in one state, and if you move to another state that doesn't have that, then all of a sudden you don't have an exemption. Now, a lot of people, when I talk about religious exemptions or when they hear about religious exemptions, their first thought is, well, I'm not a Christian Scientist, or I'm not even a member of an organized religion, I can't, exercise a religious exemption. And I want to clarify, a complete explanation of what qualifies for a religious exemption is, well, I do 2.5-hour consultations to explain that and to explain how to write a legally sound statement of beliefs. But let me give you a couple of quick overview points, because the bottom line is, for religious exemptions in the United States, it does not matter whether or not you belong to any organized religious institution at all. And it doesn't matter which one you belong to if you do belong to one. In other words, it's your personal religious beliefs or your personal interpretation of whatever your religion is. So you can be Catholic, Baptist, Buddhist, Hindu, or have no affiliation with any religious organization at all, and you can still qualify for a religious exemption. Now, there are still a few states that have laws on the books that refer to a requirement of being a member of an organized religion. Those laws have been challenged at least 5 times in state and federal courts in other states and have always been held to be unconstitutional. So if you're in a state that has that kind of a requirement, you might have a little bit harder time exercising an exemption if you don't meet their stated requirements. But it is possible to get an exemption even in those states, because there are federal court cases, and again, federal law is a higher legal authority here. There are federal court cases interpreting the federal Constitution saying that you don't have to be a member of an organized religion. So it's possible to do it even if you're in one of those states that hasn't yet gotten around to revising their laws to bring them into compliance with the federal constitutional boundaries. So, religious exemption, most widely available, most commonly used for that reason. And even if you have a philosophical exemption, I recommend looking at the religious exemption in your state, because it comes with that additional federal constitutional First Amendment protection. Now, as I said before, the laws are different in every state. In some states, you sign a form, check a box, or what have you, you have the exemption. In other states, it's not as straightforward. The Constitution permits authorities, if the state passes a law giving them this authority, again, it goes back to what is the specific wording of each state's laws. But the Constitution permits a state legislature to give itself or to delegate authority to school officials or health department officials. Again, it varies from state to state. They can be given the authority to scrutinize your religious beliefs, to decide if you qualify. And in some states, you do have to write what I call a statement of religious beliefs. You have to just describe or explain your beliefs that are opposed to vaccines. And some states at least, because of the wording of their laws, have authority to scrutinize those beliefs to decide whether or not you qualify for the exemption. This upsets a lot of people, and understandably, but I want to explain briefly, if I may, how the law works and why this is actually okay and how it's not okay, if you will. So this will make sense as I explain it. We have this so-called separation of church and state here in the United States. This is something that is inferred from the First Amendment free exercise of religion and other clauses in the First Amendment. But we have, it's a very delicate boundary, and the state or federal government can only go so far in terms of delving into your religious beliefs. So no government official or entity can lawfully tell you what you have to believe, or say that you can't believe something, or tell you that your beliefs are good or bad or right or wrong. They can't judge the quality or correctness of your beliefs. You're free to be any religion or no religion, or your own version of religions. I've had clients whose personal religious beliefs drew from 2 or more, sometimes multiple religious traditions from around the world, and other times from outside of any organized religion at all. And all of those, for legal purposes, are perfectly fine. Where the boundary is and what they can do if they pass laws giving them this authority is they can scrutinize your beliefs to see if they are religious in nature or if they're sincerely held. Now, this follows kind of a common sense thing, and this is one of the tricky quirks about the way our legal system works. Sometimes the laws do what we would think they should do from a common sense point of view. Other times, it's just not that straightforward. So, fortunately, though, this particular point that I'm about to explain is one that I think really does follow common sense thinking, and it goes like this. If government's going to give you some kind of a right in a statute concerning religion, and here we're talking about a vaccine religious exemption, then reasonably people who do not have a religious belief should not be able to benefit from that law. If it's for people with religious beliefs, you should have to have a genuine religious belief in order to have the benefit or protection of that law. Well, necessarily then the law is going to have to come up with some kind of definition for legal purposes. How does the law define religion in order to be able to determine whether or not any given individual qualifies? Now, a lot of states don't get into this. They pass laws that say if you do X, Y, Z, check the box, sign the form, or what have you, you have the exemption. They're not going to get into scrutinizing people's religious beliefs to figure out if they qualify or not. But other states, for school and daycare exemptions, do require you to state your beliefs. And for legal purposes, it doesn't matter what you think religion means or what I think religion means or is. We need to look at how the law defines that. Because at the end of the day, if there's a dispute between you and someone else about your religious exemption, you don't get to go in there and tell the judge what religion is. You may be questioned about what your religious beliefs are, but you don't get to go in there and say, Judge, here's what religion is, therefore I get the exemption. The judge is going to say, where in the law does it tell us what the legal definition of religion is, and do you meet or do your beliefs fall within that umbrella? And this is a really understandable, really common mistake or misunderstanding people have. I've seen, for example, on the internet, medical doctors arguing about, does the Bible support immunization? Is the Bible against immunization? And one doctor will say something like, well, of course the Bible is not against vaccines. It was written 2,000 years ago, long before vaccines were ever dreamed of. But, of course, you could spin that the other way. Well, of course the Bible's not for vaccines. It was written 2,000 years ago. The problem is that that's the wrong question. For purposes of a legal right, a legal exemption, that question is a theological question. What's the proper interpretation of Christianity or the Bible or Buddhism or whatever? And there's nothing wrong with theological questions and theological debates. We've had them since religion has been around. They'll be around forever, I'm sure. But it's the wrong question with respect to a legal right, a vaccine religious exemption. The proper question for legal purposes is, how does the law define religion? And again, while a complete answer is quite lengthy, in brief, the way the law defines religion, it doesn't matter whether or not you belong to an organized religion. It doesn't matter which one you belong to if you do. All that matters is that your beliefs be religious in nature and sincerely held. Now, from an analytical point of view, the obvious next question is, well, how does the law define those phrases? And that's where, again, it gets, the complete answer is quite lengthy, but the answer comes in part, in large part, from legal precedent, past court cases that have looked at real disputes and where the courts have issued a ruling. Here's where the line is in this particular situation. Here's where the line is in this particular situation. And sometimes people seeking the exemption won their cases and sometimes they lost, but when courts that have the ability to generate legal precedent, not all courts do, but when courts that have that ability choose to exercise that option, when they rule on a case, then the case becomes legal precedent, just a point of reference in the law. It says, here's how this law applies to this situation. And then the rest of us get additional information, points of reference in the law about where the boundaries are. So in one very practical, technical and practical sense, both, the boundaries of vaccine religious exemptions, like other kinds of legal boundaries, are created one court case at a time, over time, as more disputes go to court and courts issue rulings, and when available and they choose to exercise the option, they use their case to generate legal precedent to help inform the legal system and society about here's another point of reference, here's another boundary. So, understanding your rights then with respect to vaccine exemptions often requires looking at a combination of state laws, state health department regulations, state and federal constitutional provisions, and then bodies of state and federal legal precedent. It's all these things combined, and combined with the specific facts in your particular situation, that all work together and interact to determine exactly what your rights are right now in your particular situation. And that's why when people often very understandably ask what they think is a short answer question of an attorney, the response will be schedule a consultation so we can go over this in detail, if of course you'd like to do that. Many times exercising exemption is a simple, straightforward process. As I said before, you check a box, sign a form, or what have you. But it is critical to find out what the procedure is, what the correct procedure is in your state or your situation. There are a lot of wonderful, wonderful anti-vaccine websites with terrific information about what's going on with the medicine and politics and the corruption and so forth. And this is invaluable information that we need to know about how our world works today, how we ended up with the vaccine policy and laws that we have today, even though on close scrutiny it does not match up with the science, nor does it, increasingly, does it match up with the law. As I said, unconstitutional laws are being passed. But you have to look at the specific procedure. You have to be very careful when going to anti-vaccine websites for legal information. What are your exemption rights? How do you exercise them, and so forth? Because the way you exercise an exemption depends on the specific law in your specific state or your specific context, military, immigration, what have you. And a lot of anti-vaccine websites will post sample letters, forms, and things that they have created or pulled from other websites, and they may or may not comply with the proper procedure in your state or your situation. And some of the sample forms are just legally flawed in fundamental ways. So be very careful to go whenever you can to an authoritative source. Just about every state, if not at this point every state, has a website where anybody can go log on for free and search the state statutes. Go look at your state statutes. Read what the statutes say. They will tell you what exemptions you have. They will tell you how to exercise the exemption. Now, a lot of times you have to look at statutes and health department regulations to get the whole picture in terms of what are the exemptions and what's the procedure. But that's your starting place for a school exemption, the state statute, the state health department regulations. There are also websites that link to or post those laws, and some of those I think are pretty reliable. The National Vaccine Information Center is my personal favorite, but I link on my own website to 3 different sites that post state laws. And that's really your starting place. Now, if you have questions beyond that point, there's a lot of places you can go. Sometimes you can go to a local or state health department and get answers. For example, a very common question, do vaccine exemptions apply to private schools? This is another one of those questions where the answer is going to vary from state to state because it depends, again, on the wording of each state's laws. There are a couple of states that I know off the top of my head, Texas and New Jersey, where it's very difficult to exercise a religious exemption in a private school. Other states, like my own state of North Carolina, it's clear to me that all schools, public and private, have to honor religious exemption. So it's a state-by-state issue. That's the kind of question you could call a local health department or state health department and should be able to get a good answer. Now, I hear people report back to me anecdotally with a variety of different kinds of experiences with health departments. Sometimes it turns out to be very helpful and other times not helpful. So, you know, it's worth a try. If it doesn't work, you know, worse off. But that's another example of an authoritative source where you can often get good answers. And health departments have websites. You can go to websites and usually get a lot of good information there and not have to pick up the phone and talk to someone directly if you're uncomfortable doing that. And they can be very pushy in a pro-vaccine way, and so I understand why people might not want to get into that over the phone. But check out the websites. Often they have information on websites. But again, that's an authoritative source that when they're clear and know what they're talking about can be very helpful. Of course, if you can find an attorney who's familiar with the law in this area, that's a really difficult thing to do. I only know one other attorney in the whole country that I can send people to is a guy in New York. He does only school exemptions, as far as I know, not any of these other categories I mentioned. And he flies under the radar. He doesn't even post it on his website. So it's just really hard to find an eligible attorney. But I've worked with local attorneys all over the country to help them when a local attorney is needed. And I work with clients directly all over the country as well, because even though I'm only licensed in North Carolina, all attorneys are licensed in one or more states or territories. There's no such thing as a federal law license. All attorneys can practice federal law. And even when you're talking about a state religious exemption law, the boundaries of the rights, what does and doesn't qualify for religious exemption, and if you're in a state where you have to write your beliefs, explain or describe your beliefs, what does or doesn't qualify for a religious exemption, whether it's a state law or a federal law, is determined by the First Amendment. So it's a federal law question, even when you're starting with a state religious exemption law. So that's what enables me to work with clients directly on religious exemptions all over the country. And then there are other issues that are purely federal law, such as vaccines in the workplace. That concerns federal civil rights law, or military is federal regulations, immigration, federal regulations, and so forth. So, but where I can't work with people directly for one reason or another, I can work with local attorneys. So, but anyway, you find some person or some source that is authoritative because the other sources are not as reliable. And there are people who have lost exemptions by relying on information they got off of anti-vaccine websites. Now, I have no doubt that there are also people who have succeeded using that information, so it's not an all or nothing proposition. It's just a higher risk if you're not getting your information and support from an authoritative source. So let me move on to another topic or two here. Another topic that comes up frequently has to do with newborn infants getting the hepatitis B vaccine. And you may have heard some of the occasional horror stories where a parent refuses the hepatitis B vaccine in the hospital for her newborn, or his or her newborn, and the child ends up being taken away. And I heard a story, just a horrible story, coming from Pennsylvania, where a mother refused the hepatitis B vaccine. The doctor or nurse calls in child protective services or social services, and they take the baby away from the mother. There are a couple of different aspects to this in terms of legal analysis, and both of them are just so distressing because that is so blatantly unnecessary, and I think, frankly, unlawful. But this sort of thing can happen. I heard from a parent here in North Carolina several years ago. She reported that she was told if she didn't allow her newborn child to get the hepatitis B vaccine, that they would take the child away from her. And in North Carolina, the law says you have 3 months to give that first hepatitis B shot. You don't even have to exercise an exemption. You can just say, no, thank you, I'm going to do that, next week or in a month or at the end of the 3-month period. So here's the bottom line. Doctors and healthcare workers are very aggressive. They don't understand the law. They overstep legal boundaries, unfortunately, on a regular basis. So in this arena in particular, it is critical to develop a plan in advance to get everybody involved on board ahead of time so that when you're in the hospital ready to give birth or with your loved one giving birth, you can focus on exactly that, the birth, and not be distracted by having to argue or battle or fight someone, or God forbid have to have a social worker come in and take your child away from you right after being born. Because these kind of things, while they're unlawful, are nevertheless a legitimate risk, a real risk. Now, if you're planning a home birth, get a backup plan anyway, because some people who plan a home birth end up in the hospital. So you plan your plan B, you set up your plan B, that if your home birth, something doesn't go the way you plan and you end up in the hospital, you're not dealing with this issue unprepared. But there's sort of 2 basic levels to it as a starting place anyway, analytically. On the one, we have a constitutional right to parent our children. That includes making medical decisions. It's not an absolute right, and I think most of us, if we thought about it, would agree it shouldn't be an absolute right, because there are, in a society as complex and large as ours, there's always going to be those situations where there's a parent who is abusing a child or failing to give proper care, and a child is needlessly suffering one way or the other. And the state should have authority to step in and protect those children. The problems with that in today's society has to do with where the lines are. Who gets to decide what is a situation where somebody should step in, and who gets to step in, and what authority they have, and so forth. So there are serious problems with all these lines, but the basic fundamental concept, I think most people would agree on. And here's how it works constitutionally in a nutshell. The right comes from the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause and a series of federal U.S. Supreme Court cases over the last 100 years or so that have spelled out in very clear and sweeping terms the parents' right and responsibility to parent their children. And so again, it's not an unbounded right, but it's a very, very broad right. And where the state in concept has and should have the right to step in is when a child is either suffering significant harm or is at imminent risk of harm. Harm or imminent risk of harm. If a child is being abused and somebody discovers that and reports the parents to Child Protective Services, they ought to be able to come in, and if they confirm that there's abuse, pull a child out and protect that child. Or actually, if they have reasonable suspicion that there's abuse, they can pull the child and then look for the evidence afterwards. A whole other topic we won't get into because, of course, that results inevitably in some amount of unnecessary removals happening. But the concept, the implementation is problematic, but the basic concept is sound. Well, hepatitis B, I don't know about you folks, but I have never heard of a newborn child who was sexually promiscuous or an intravenous drug user. And so newborn children are not at imminent risk of harm from hepatitis B unless the mother has hepatitis B. But of course, you test for that before the birth. And if you have one of those rare instances where the mother does have hepatitis B while she's pregnant, then you make a plan about how you're going to handle the birth and you take that into account. But you're not doing a newborn child any favor whatsoever by injecting them with a hepatitis B vaccine. They are not at risk of hepatitis B. The reason that newborns are injected with a hepatitis B vaccine, it's two reasons. One, because the research shows that a newborn will develop antibodies from hepatitis B. That's the reason that you don't get all the other vaccines right at birth, is because the newborn body will not respond by generating antibodies to the other vaccines, or they'd be getting a whole list of vaccines at birth, I can assure you. But the reason is because the research presumably shows, I have not looked at this personally, but I'm going to make a point, presumably shows that a newborn child will generate hepatitis B antibodies if they get the hepatitis B vaccine at birth, and because it's highly profitable to require every newborn child to get the vaccine. There's always money involved here. I'm convinced that there are other agendas besides money involved with the vaccine controversy, but you don't have to go any farther than the follow the money syndrome to see that there are serious problems here. And if you didn't require every child to get a hepatitis B vaccine, that'd be millions and millions of dollars of lost profit to the pharmaceutical industry. So that is probably one of the driving agendas, if not a primary driving agenda for this. It has nothing to do with health. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to inject a newborn child with any vaccine, frankly, but certainly with in particular, hepatitis B vaccine. But it's a requirement probably in most states around the country. It's a law. So if you are required to get a vaccine, you either get it or you find out what the legal exemptions are and you exercise an exemption, or you do something to get around it legally. And this is a good point for me to pause and make a point. Legally, there are only 3 places you can be with respect to required vaccines for yourself or your children. You either do the vaccines, you exercise an exemption according to whatever the procedure is in your state or your situation, or you do neither of those first 2. It's the third category that is seriously problematic, because if you're not doing a required vaccine and you're not exercising a proper exemption, then you may not be in compliance with the law. And that's the place where you may be accused of, if this is with respect to your children, accused of medically neglecting your children, or some other such label that says essentially you're behaving in an unlawful manner, and then that's the place where legally somebody can step in. And this is probably what was going on with this case a few months ago that got into the alternative news in Pennsylvania. The mother there was not saying this is against my religious beliefs, and Pennsylvania has only medical and religious exemptions. And so it may very well have been that if she would have said it's against my religious beliefs, we can't get the hepatitis B vaccine, who knows for sure, but she might have gotten cooperation rather than the resistance and personal attack and bringing in child protective services and so forth. But all of this then just goes back to what I was saying earlier. In the newborn situation, you put together a plan in advance, you make sure everybody's on board. If you get resistance and you need to, you bring in an attorney to explain to everybody involved that you have these constitutional rights and it's not really up to them to decide whether or not you can refuse the vaccine. Because most of the exemption laws are with respect to school and daycare. They don't say anything about hospital births, and so many times there's just not. In fact, I'm not aware specifically of any exemption law that refers directly and specifically to the hepatitis B vaccine at birth. So it can be a confusing area, but the rights are clearly there. But I think, despite that in that case in Pennsylvania, that the medical staff violated constitutional rights, because even if the mother had no religious objections to the hepatitis B vaccine, and even if that state only offers medical and religious exemptions, that mother still has a 14th Amendment due process constitutional right to make medical decisions for her child, and nobody can intervene or override that unless there's a harm or imminent risk of harm. And the only imminent risk of harm in connection with the hepatitis B vaccine is the harm from the vaccine itself. There's no imminent risk of harm. No newborn child is at high risk of developing hepatitis B unless the mother has hepatitis B, which occurs in very rare situations. So I think the mother's constitutional rights were violated. So, but you don't want to be in the situation of having a winning legal argument. You want to be not in that dispute in the first place. You don't want to have to go to court and win your case if it means having had your child taken away from you. You would like to be in there in the hospital, have the birth go smoothly, have nobody give you any grief at all about refusing the vaccine, and everything goes wonderful and smooth. So get that plan together in advance. If you have concerns or questions, if you really want to make sure you have everything nailed down, airtight, so to speak, you know, pull in an attorney to help you if you want to do that. That maybe is the ideal way. But this takes us to another question. When do you need an attorney? Many times you don't. And there's a body of knowledge, you know, people in the alternative vaccine community would probably generally agree that to make informed vaccine decisions generally, there's this sort of minimum body of information you have to have. You have to understand that there's corruption in the political and industry arenas, in the pharmaceutical industry, in the state and federal health agencies. You have to understand that the current policy and law is not sound in terms of being based on solid science and so forth. You have to understand information that you're not going to get, much of which you won't get from the CDC or most pediatricians or medical doctors. And so you have to be proactive in seeking out and finding and getting that information and looking at conflicting views and opinions, and exercise your own intelligent discretion, and you decide what's more reliable, who's more convincing. The same thing is true with respect to vaccine exemptions or vaccine rights. There's a minimum body of information that people need to have if they're going to make informed decisions about vaccine exemptions. You need to understand a little bit about how the legal system works and how the laws vary and how the rights work, how these different parts and pieces, the constitutions and legal precedent, as well as the statutes and regulations, how all of these things interact and relate. And understand that sometimes the answer to a legal question varies depending on what state you're in or what your situation is compared to somebody else's situation. A body of information. I put together my website, my primary website, vaccinerights.com, and wrote an ebook called The Authoritative Guide to Vaccine Legal Exemptions in order to help people to get that information that's needed to make informed decisions about how you proceed, including do you need an attorney. But in general, the situations where I highly recommend that you consult an attorney are any situation involving a religious exemption where you have to state or explain your beliefs. Because as I explained earlier, on the one hand, in terms of who can potentially qualify, it's really, really broad. You don't have to belong to a church. It doesn't matter which one you belong to if you do. Your beliefs just have to be religious in nature and sincerely held as the law defines those phrases. But it turns out, at least in my experience, the vast majority of people who write their own statement of beliefs without getting information about how the law works will wander into one or more of what I call legal pitfalls. It just turns out that the way the law works in this arena with respect to what specific beliefs do or don't qualify and how you put together a statement of religious beliefs, this is not consistent with most people's common sense approach. So This would be some school exemptions. Obviously, not all states require you to explain your beliefs. Situations like employees, nurses, and doctors and other healthcare workers would be required to get flu shots. That's a federal civil rights law issue the vast majority of the time, and you've got to explain your beliefs there usually. Military, that's part of the military exemption regulations, have to state your beliefs. Immigration is a very workable situation, but it's also probably the most complicated one because there are several parts and pieces to putting together the application. So that's a place where I definitely recommend that people work with an attorney. But many times, as I said before, if you've got something that's straightforward like signing a form, checking a box, that sort of thing, you don't have to hire an attorney to do that, of course. And if you just want to get general information without the expense of a consultation with an attorney, the ebook is a really good way to do that. It's not very expensive at all, and it covers much more detail and information than you would get in a consultation, costing many times the cost of the ebook anyway. The place where a consultation is really helpful is when you've got a specific situation that you want somebody to talk to you about, and you want to be able to interact with that person, the attorney, have a back and forth. And many times particular conflicts or situations or concerns are ones where you really need that back and forth with consultation. But if you're just looking for background information to understand how the law works, and you don't have a situation that's either crisis or potential crisis, you may not need an ebook at all. I've got many, many articles I've written about how the law works with respect to exemptions and waivers that are out there on the internet. Many of them linked from my site, vaccinerights.com, but many out there posted and published by Natural News and other websites. So there's lots of reliable information out there coming from myself, having worked at this point for over 10 years, with clients around the country in over a dozen different contexts and subcontexts. So you never know it all. I'm learning all the time, and God willing, I will keep learning more and more. But I've gotten a good handle on a lot of this up to this point, and happy to share that with people in articles. My ebook, consultations, if that's appropriate and something you want. But people are always welcome to call or email me with questions, and if I can answer them, I will, or I will answer them to the best of my ability. So,
Alan,
yeah.
I had a question. This is Bill Hewitt in Marion, Indiana. And as I understand, I work with the school system that I do substitute bus driving and substitute teaching. And the other exemption that I am told is the best way to prevent disease is to naturally have that disease, like measles or something, at an early age, and that the antibodies remain with you for many, many years. And they allow you to do a titer test to see if those antibodies are there, and if they are, that automatically exempts you from the need for a vaccination for that particular vaccination. And I believe that's in all 50 states. Is that correct?
Well, that's it's going to be a state-by-state question, whether or not you can just present titers in lieu of getting the vaccines or exercising exemption. And so the short answer is, if the state law says you can do that, then you can do it. Now, it might be that, and I'm not aware with school exemptions of any situation where there's a law that specifically says, get the vaccines or show us, titer test. But I'm aware, at least generally, of situations where people have been allowed to do that, and it might be something that's more common in situations where there's not a clear procedure. For example, when I talk about healthcare workers, and federal civil rights law, there's not a federal exemption per se for healthcare workers. What there is federal civil rights law that requires employers to accommodate their employees' religious beliefs and practices. So there's not a clear procedure spelled out for an exemption in the workplace like there is in state law for students. And the state laws usually are for students and don't apply to healthcare workers or people outside of a school context. So it just depends on, for example, whether or not there's a clear procedure spelled out, and if there is a clear procedure spelled out, what is that procedure? So again, the short answer is if there's a law that says you can do that, then of course you can do it. If there's not a law that says you can do that, you could certainly offer that and see if somebody would accept that. And it's really interesting. The CDC points out not only, first of all, that only 85 to 95% of vaccinated children actually develop immunity, and those are pretty high figures. You can look in the medical literature and find for some vaccines it's lower than that. But let's give them benefit of the doubt for the moment. What they're saying is 5 to 15% of vaccinated children don't develop immunity. And the CDC also tells us that non-vaccinated children can get, and you just have to forgive my sense of humor here, or lack thereof, non-vaccinated children can get this rare condition that most people have never heard of called natural immunity. But on a more serious note, the CDC says you can get natural immunity without even developing symptoms. You can be exposed to a disease, not get sick, not even know you were exposed, and yet have titers, have measurable titers showing that you're immune from the disease. So just because you've, if you're lucky enough to have never been vaccinated, or you have children who have never been vaccinated, that doesn't, and maybe they never got sick and had a measles rash or whatever, that does not mean they are not immune to measles or any of the other diseases. The only way you can know somebody's immune status is to do a titer test, because there are vaccinated children who are immune and not immune, at least if you define immunity by measuring for antibodies. Whether that equals immunity is really a whole separate question, but that's the way the current medical community assesses immunity. They say, are there antibodies in the blood? So with that as, for the moment, just for the sake of a point, if we use that as our measure of whether or not somebody is immune or has immunity, there are vaccinated children who are immune and not immune, and there are unvaccinated children who are both immune and others who are not immune. And some of the unvaccinated children who are immune never got sick, and you would never know that they were immune unless you did the titer test. So if the issue is really about immunity, then a titer test ought to be something that would be just as good, in fact even better, than a vaccination record, because the vaccination record, even if it's an honest one, still doesn't guarantee that the vaccinated person has immunity as they measure it in terms of antibodies. So, but this is really just one example, and a very disturbing one to me, or curious one, where the medical community is inconsistent with its own mainstream information. Because doctors will treat vaccination as though if you are vaccinated, you're protected. If you're not vaccinated, you're going to kill everybody. And that's just not how it works, even in the mainstream medical model. You don't have to go out into the deeper, more accurate truth of the alternative information on this to see that the current system, the way it operates, is inconsistent with itself, hypocritical. I think I've gotten a good ways away, Bill, from your question, but again, short answer is if the law says so, yes. If it doesn't say so, probably not. But then sometimes people can negotiate. You know, well, can I just show you the titer test? Sometimes they'll settle for that. So I don't see any reason. I don't see any harm in asking. You know.
Right. I was told by the school nurse, who I guess acts as an intermediary with the school and the medical community, that if you could show them a titer test that said you were immune to that disease, then you did not need that vaccination, I guess is what I saw. Another question on this is, I'm also setting up a homeschool for kids that don't want the vaccination. And it's my understanding if you're homeschooling, you do not need the vaccination.
Well, first of all, good for you, and I hope that that is a successful venture for you and all concerned. But again, that's a state-by-state question. I just started homeschooling my youngest son this past September here in North Carolina. I still have to have, under North Carolina law, either the vaccination record or the religious exemption statement that's required for attending public or private school. So again, it's just a state-by-state situation. There was a real interesting case a little while back in West Virginia. Now in West Virginia, they have only a medical exemption. That doesn't mean you don't have the constitutional right to the free exercise of religion. It just means you can't exercise that right to go to school without getting the vaccines. So the case involved parents and a high school senior, I think, a high school girl, and the parents had religious objections to vaccines, and under state law, they couldn't go to send the child to public school. But what they ended up getting in this case, if I understood it correctly, was a court ruling where the judge ordered the school to provide an education for the child at home. And I thought this was a very interesting case, and I'll just give you my first kind of read on it. And I'm not offering a formal legal analysis. I don't know the details of the case well at all, and I haven't read a written court opinion on this. But it sounds to me like the court did what may be a proper thing, that the court recognized that these parents have a federal constitutional First Amendment right to the free exercise of religion that's a higher legal authority than the state law, which requires vaccines without allowing religious exemptions in order to go to public school. And the judge the judge cannot order the school to accept the parents. There's some legal precedent that tells us, sort of a long story short here, that tells us states are not required to offer a vaccine religious exemption. And so, you know, given that, it's really interesting to me that 48 of them do, but they're not required to offer that. But the parents may still have some other state right, maybe a state constitutional right to an education. And if they have a higher federal constitutional right to the free exercise of religion, then the state cannot withhold the education from the child merely because the child, if the child's parents are because of a higher federal constitutional right. In other words, that would mean that the state would be overriding the higher legal authority, which the state can't lawfully do. So my understanding again is that the child ended up, you know, being taught at home, but that the state was ordered to provide that education, which I find very interesting. So, you know, a lot of these things you just have to see how they play out over time, and whether or not they start a trend, or if more cases come up in other states and the courts rule differently, you know, and so forth. We just have to see how it all plays out over time. But I thought it was very interesting. Getting back to your question, though, clearly in West Virginia, homeschooling does get you, or can get you, out of the vaccines. And there is no exemption there unless you happen to have a medical exemption. There is no exemption there that you still have to exercise as far as I know, in West Virginia. But again, it's going to be one of those questions that varies state to state, and you just have to look at the specific wording in your state's laws, or talk with state authorities, could be a health department or attorney, someone who can give you clarification on how the law works in your particular state. It's just going to vary from state to state.
Now, my children were born using a midwife, and she did not vaccinate the children, and that was one of the reasons we did that. Are they required to vaccinate as a health worker? Are they required to vaccinate a newborn?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if I could paraphrase the question just slightly, who has the authority or obligation specifically to administer the hepatitis B vaccine? And I hate to sound repetitiously evasive, Bill, but again, that's the sort of thing that'll vary from state to state. There'll be something in state law that says, first of all, whether or not the vaccine is required, and then who has authority to administer vaccines. And I don't have a clear understanding of how that works specifically anywhere. But again, I expect it could vary. It could be that in some states, and I'm guessing here, honestly, but it could be that in some states, maybe it has to be a medical doctor, maybe in other states a doctor or certain level of nurses or other healthcare professionals. But I expect that's the sort of thing that is either spelled out somewhere in statutes or perhaps more likely health department regulations, or that somewhere in the law is spelled out that somebody such as the attending physician would have discretion or authority to decide. But I'm not familiar beyond that with specifics on it. It's an excellent question.
The vaccine court handles all the injuries from vaccinations or the vaccines. And do you practice with the vaccine court? Because only attorneys that are certified by the vaccine court can practice there.
My practice is limited exclusively to exemptions and waivers and vaccine rights issues. I also work with legislative activists around the country to help them formulate arguments, and on occasion I've worked with legislators directly around the country, or even spoken to legislative committees about vaccine legislative issues. But I don't work with vaccine injury. I have some general knowledge and awareness about how the system works. And for example, to my great surprise when I stumbled on it, here in North Carolina there is a state injury compensation program. And so I don't know if North Carolina is unique in that respect or not, but apparently the federal system is not the only system. And I don't even know how the state system here works because I haven't interacted with it and don't practice in that area. I just remember stumbling upon the statutes and learning about it, being quite surprised. I think people would have to first go to the federal system, and there is a list of attorneys, and this is people can email me and ask me for the link, and I'll send them the link. There's a link, but it's the vaccine court has a website, and on their website they have a document, I think it's a PDF file, that lists all of the attorneys in the country who asked to be listed as accepting vaccine injury cases. And there, I believe there's somewhere around, if not over 100 attorneys in the country on that list. Now, I don't have specific information, at least not in any details, about anyone in particular, so at this point I don't have any sort of inside scoop about, oh, you definitely want to go to this one or you definitely want to avoid that one. But there is a list there, and there are, I did a quick count, I think there were attorneys in at least 30 states that are accepting these kinds of cases. You don't have to have an attorney that's near you in a vaccine injury case. The cases, when they go to court in Washington, D.C., and because it's federal law, you can work with an attorney anywhere in the country who is, and you may have a piece of information there that I wasn't even specifically aware of. If there's some sort of special certification you have to be able to practice in the vaccine courts, I wouldn't be surprised. That certainly makes sense to me. But you can work with anybody who is qualified to handle those kind of cases anywhere in the country. So You can also just do an internet search for vaccine injury attorney, and you'll pull up a list of firms that do that. So there are lots of attorneys and firms around the country that handle vaccine injury cases. There are people who file those petitions on their own without going to an attorney. And nobody, as far as I know, is ever required to have an attorney to pursue a lawsuit. But the practical reality is that our legal system is complex. And I really wish I could say otherwise, but I think in most important legal issues, if it's really important to you, consult an attorney, find out how to do things. If you're in a legal situation where you just can't afford an attorney, and in the vaccine injury cases, I believe the attorneys get paid by the government. I don't think you have to have money out of pocket up front.
That's correct.
And that's true with most personal injury cases generally. Whereas in other areas of law, most of the time you've got to, put your life savings and commit your next born child or whatever to be able to afford them. And it's sad. That's another topic we could get into another time. But to me, it just goes to sort of underlying flaws in the capitalistic system. The two things that people need most, healthcare and when they need it, legal representation or legal advice, are the two most expensive things out there for most people most of the time. And it's just exactly backwards. It ought to be the other way around. Anything that is most important ought to be something that is readily accessible and available to everyone, and yet in a capitalistic society it's exactly the opposite. Those things that are most important are most highly valued, and they're the most expensive, and therefore the fewest people who need them can afford them.
Yeah,
but,
one of the go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
One of the things that stood out in my looking at the vaccine court was the vaccine injuries are extremely underreported, so that the cases, I guess there's a timeline in there that if you don't report the injury within a certain time frame, then you lose the chance to get compensated by the vaccine court. And the most recent case I heard of was the Hannah Poling case, where she was awarded $20 million by the vaccine court for autism. It's one of the few cases I've ever heard of like that. Would you care to comment on that?
Sure. The federal government, I may have mentioned this earlier, pays out roughly $100 million a year. The FDA and CDC and the American Association of Physicians and Surgeons has also gone public with their estimate that 90% of the adverse events never even get reported. So, of course, you can't count what isn't reported, but it's pretty clear that there are multiple credible sources that tell us that the vast majority of serious vaccine injury and death doesn't get reported. Now, this is despite the fact that there's a federal law requiring physicians to report any suspected adverse event. However, there's no penalty to them for not reporting, and there is peer pressure to not report, or they are also, and this is just so distressing to me, Bill. I hear over and over again anecdotally from people saying this, where the doctor says, oh, it's just a coincidence, it doesn't have anything to do with the vaccine. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that you can't generalize like that. The only way you can tell in any specific situation whether a condition that follows a vaccine is related to the vaccine is if you do some sort of medical or scientific testing to rule it in or rule it out. So when doctors say, oh no, it's coincidence, I just don't understand how somebody who's smart enough to get in and out of med school and pass the medical exams and become a medical doctor can have something like that come out of their mouths and not just see the obvious lack of logic to it. Right. But nonetheless, this is what I hear over and over again. This is what happens. And so we have no idea what the actual rate is. And so anyone who tells you, well, yeah, there's the occasional death or disability, but look at all the millions of people we're saving with vaccines, there's a net benefit. There's no data out there to make that calculation. So, but there is a statute of limitations, a period of time that once you know or that the injury manifests, and whether or not you know the compensation program exists, you have this period of time. I think it's probably a 3-year statute of limitations for an injury. It may be
Yes.
1 or 2 years for a death.
Yep.
Shorter one if there's a death. And if you haven't filed your petition within that time, then you lose your chance to get the petition. And I have had people over recent years, Bill, call me or email me, how do I work this program? You know, my 15-year-old child, was injured at age 1 or 2 by the vaccines, and it just tears my heart out because these people didn't know about the system, and there were, years past that 3-year limit.
Yes.
And there's nothing they can do that I know of at that point. It's that old ignorance is no excuse for the law kind of thing. And now there are some potential kinks in the works there, so to speak, or there are situations and circumstances where a statute of limitations can be what they call tolled, T-O-L-L-E-D, where it's the clock stops running or doesn't start running for some reason. In the practice of law generally, you are held accountable for anything that you knew or should have known. And if, let's say, you get a vaccine and maybe you don't have something that shows up as a qualifying injury for some period of months afterwards, probably the clock doesn't start running until there's that severe enough injury or effect from the vaccine. It has to have a certain minimum level of severity or it won't qualify at all. And I believe that maybe includes something like it have to be symptoms that are sustained for a certain period of time. But there was this one really disturbing case where a medical doctor developed multiple sclerosis from a hepatitis B vaccine, but she had symptoms that appeared and disappeared and came and went. And the bottom line is, by the time she qualified to file the petition, she had already passed the statute of limitations. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Nobody should be excluded from filing because they didn't qualify to file until it was too late to file. I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah. And
yet the ultimate decision, the case went up on appeal and it went through different, reviews and so forth. And the final decision in that was that she did not qualify or was not able to get compensation. So there's just some really disturbing things about the way the system works from time to time. Fortunately, her situation is a pretty unusual one, not at all common. But there are people who are excluded from the system on technicalities that don't come up in other kinds of injury cases that are outside of the injury compensation program. So the system, while supposedly having been originally designed to make it easier, this was the famous claim anyway, when the system was designed and implemented into law, it was designed supposedly to make it easier for people who are injured or the families of people killed by vaccines to get compensation. It has turned out to be a very, very difficult system to succeed in from the point of view of those looking for compensation.
Yes, I agree. Well,
I got...
Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Please allow me just one other comment here.
Sure.
You talked about autism, and I got off on a different tangent there. I want to come back to the autism question. There's a New York Law School professor, Mary Holland, who worked with another attorney, Bob Krakow, and some other non-attorneys, and they ended up publishing an article in a law journal. They sampled cases from the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. They didn't go through all of them by any means, but they went through a sampling. They found over 80 cases. I don't remember the exact number, but it was over 80 cases.
82.
Where
82 cases.
Yeah, thank you. Autistic children had been compensated for vaccine injury. And somebody mentioned that raised that with the CDC, and their response was, "Oh, we don't look at that. When we're assessing whether vaccines cause autism, we don't look at the injury compensation program." Well, of course they don't, because it would undermine their claim that vaccines don't cause autism. That's a whole nother topic. There's tons of evidence in the medical literature and other sources that support the autism vaccine connection.
Could I add a point in here?
Please.
I am very familiar with the autism cases because whenever I drive school bus, it's with the special needs kids, and the majority of them are diagnosed as ASD or with autism. And the CDC hired a Danish scientist, actually he was a psychiatrist, to do studies for them starting in 2002, and they paid him $14.6 million for the studies to prove that vaccines had no link to autism. He did the studies, and he had a fellow scientist working under him, and he was supposed to pay him part of the $14.6 million. And he took the money and ran. And so the other scientist, and what he did was he got paid through a university called Aarhus in Denmark. And so what the CDC did was they paid the $14.6 million to Aarhus University. And then they distributed the money to the chief scientist, which was Dr. Paul Thorsen. Well, Dr. Paul Thorsen has been indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice for fraud and embezzlement, and he's under the Office of Inspector General. He's on their 10 most wanted list of criminals. And the reason he got there was because the scientists that didn't get paid the money squealed on him to the CDC and Aarhus University and said all his studies are fraudulent. And he proved it. And yet the CDC, Dr. Forget her name, but she testified on the House hearing, the O&GR committee in 2012, November 29th, I remember the date. She testified that, and what they did was they sent her a subpoena, and she had to provide all the information because they were covering autism at that time. And she testified to the committee that Dr. Paul Thorsen was unavailable because he was hiding out in Belgium, and that all his information in the studies was with him. So she couldn't support any of the studies, but she testified that the CDC would still go ahead and use the studies to prove vaccines were okay. And that was sort of unbelievable. Just amazing.
It's mind-boggling, and yet this is how the system works. Now, I'm going to go out on a little bit of a limb here, Bill. I believe, this is my personal belief, I believe that the vast majority of people who work for the pharmaceutical industry, who work in state and federal health agencies, majority of people in the medical community are honest, decent people of integrity who just want a good day's pay for a good day's work, give or take.
Yes.
Many of them are misinformed. But I believe adamantly at the same time that there's a small number of people in key decision-making positions that there's absolutely a conspiracy at that level. And this is this instance with Dr. Thorsen is particularly revealing in this respect. That you have something as profound as what you just described, and it never hits the mainstream news. Nobody other than those of us in the alternative community who are looking for information beyond the mainstream media and mainstream authorities, hear about stuff like this. And there's another piece of it you may also be aware of as well. There's a nonprofit organization called COMED, short for the Coalition for Mercury-Free Drugs.
Yes.
They used the Freedom of Information Act to get some emails from the CDC back in emails from back in 2002, I think. And CDC authorities, officials are having this exchange with study authors. In one of these studies, that claim to prove that vaccines don't cause autism. And they're talking about data they have that showed when they took the mercury out of vaccines, the autism rates went down. And they're trying to figure out or decide amongst themselves whether or not to publish this data. And ultimately, they decided not to publish that data and instead published data in what later became informally known as the Danish study, because it was looking at Danish children, claiming that here's the proof that vaccines don't cause autism. Now, I'm not a criminal law attorney, but my common sense meter is flying off the scale here, saying this has got to be criminal fraud. You have information showing physical harm and how to reduce physical harm, and you're withholding that from the public. And there are people all over the world relying on these studies, saying vaccines don't cause autism. Here's the proof. You know, you wacko anti-vaccine people, get off of your, position there, and let's all, get back to the real world where vaccines are safe and effective. And we have now objective proof that this was deliberately, fraudulently withheld, the fact that vaccines do cause autism. Now, that's just one of many pieces of information to support the position that vaccines cause autism. There are, published medical studies as well. But
there's another scientist in Washington. She founded a company called SCPI, Scientific Sound Choice Pharmaceutical Institute, Dr. Teresa Deisher. And she just published a study in 2010. It's an amazing study on autism. And in the study, she proved why COMED couldn't get their case across to the CDC. Because they couldn't answer the question was, well, they've had mercury in the vaccines since 1930. Why didn't it start the autism epidemic before 1979? And Dr. Deisher answered that question. She answered the question, and it promptly got cut off from all funding from the NIH and the CDC. And she can't get her work published. But I'm trying to get it published. What she did was she proved the vaccines. She's an expert on this. She's worked in the industry for 19 years. And she's got 23 issued U.S. patents. So she's no dummy. And she proved that in 1979 was when the actual epidemic started. And the reason that it started was because President Jimmy Carter approved a change in the vaccine manufacturing from the animal cell lines to the aborted fetal cell lines. And that in that process change, what it did was it created DNA that was the same DNA length as in the people being vaccinated. So it created a risk of what they call insertional mutagenesis. And that trigger, it set off an environmental trigger. And she tracked the vaccines. She's got them all plotted. And I won't go into all the details on this, but basically, if you get a chance, go and read her study, because there's absolutely no question she got the timeline with the changes in the autism rates, and this was backed up by the EPA, which published another study that agreed and confirmed her study on the 1988 change point. And that's why we've gotten to a case where now autism is 2% of the population. But anyway, I want to thank you for a tremendous presentation.
Well, thank you very much for having me. You're obviously very knowledgeable yourself, but have also obviously gone a step beyond that to be active and proactive, and it's just a real pleasure and honor to have shared time with you and through you today. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Well, I learned a lot. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.